Following is an extract from letter 16 of Meditations of the Tarot, the Tower of Destruction. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Saviour, for he has regarded the low estate of his handmaiden. For behold, henceforth all generations will call me blessed. He has scattered those who have proud thoughts in their hearts. He has put down the mighty from their thrones, and he has exalted those of low degree. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty-handed. He who exalts himself will be abased, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. The kingdom of God is as if a man should scatter seed upon the ground, and should sleep and rise night and day, and the seed should sprout and grow, he knows not how. Dear unknown friend, the generation of artificial demons and the nature of the entities of hierarchies of the left constituted the principal theme of the preceding letter. One could ask oneself, after having let pass in review before the inner eye all that one knows concerning the diverse beings of the world of evil, whether it is not so, given that the flesh itself is innocent, and the kernel of the human being is in the image of God, that it is the demons and entities of the hierarchies of the left alone who are the cause of evil, and that without them there would be no evil in human life and in the history of mankind. The question is not new. It was a preoccupation in antiquity, already in the 3rd century of our era. But there is in man, notably in his soul and not in his body, a seed of evil of his own, without which temptation coming from outside would not exert any action on him. Because temptation would be impotent if it did not find a terrain already prepared in the human soul. As the 15th arcanum is related to demoniacal evil, so the 16th arcanum is related to evil, that is, to evil which does not come from outside, to human evil, which does not come from outside, but which certainly has its origin within the human soul. The unfortunate misunderstanding locating innate human evil in the body instead of in the soul is due to a tendency towards a materialistic interpretation of the biblical story of paradise and the fall. Indeed, if paradise is understood as a place on the terrestrial or material plane, and if the fall is similarly understood as having taken place on this plane, innate human evil cannot be understood otherwise than as biologically hereditary, that is, that it is the flesh which bears it and transmits the seed of evil from generation to generation. Then it is the flesh which is the enemy of the soul, and against which one has to struggle. Hence, one disciplines it by flagellation, one weakens it by depriving it of food and sleep, and one scorns it and mistreats it in many ways. One is ashamed of one's body. However, it is the body which, rightly, has more reason to be ashamed of the soul inhabiting it than the latter of the body. For the body is a miracle of wisdom, harmony, and stability, which does not merit scorn, but rather the admiration of the soul. For example, can the soul boast of moral principles as stable as the body's skeleton? Is it as indefatigable and as faithful in its sentiments as, for example, the heart, which beats day and night? Does it possess a wisdom comparable to that of the body, which knows how to harmonize such opposing things as water and fire, air and solid matter? Whilst the soul is torn by opposing desires and feelings, this contemptible body knows how to unite opposing elements and make them collaborate. The air that it breathes, the solid matter of food, the water that it drinks, and the fire, warmth that it produces unceasingly within it. And if this does not suffice to change scorn into respect, admiration, and gratitude, then one can recall, if one is a Christian, that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, inhabited this flesh, and that he honoured it to the point of uniting himself with it in the Incarnation. Similarly, if one is a Buddhist or a Brahmanist, one should not forget that Buddha and Krishna also inhabited this flesh, and that it served them well in the accomplishing of their respective missions. Negative asceticism, directed against the body and not for celestial things, is the practical consequence of the materialistic interpretation of paradise and the fall. However, the fact alone that a cherubim was placed at the east of the Garden of Eden with a flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life suffices to drive away any shadow of doubt. Here it is a matter of a plane higher than the terrestrial plane, and it was therefore souls who committed the original sin, and the body has nothing to do with it. The fall occurred prior to the terrestrial life of mankind. This is the Hermetic doctrine, called cosmou, which was taken up by Pythagoras and Plato, and was represented in the first centuries of the Christian era by Origen. Origen taught that God had created all souls equal, but that amongst these souls some sinned in the spiritual world and had to leave it for the earth. These are human souls. Others, on the contrary, in turning towards God, perfected themselves and became angels. The doctrine that the pre-existent soul, in having sinned, took into itself the seed of evil in the pre-terrestrial sphere, has as a practical consequence positive asceticism, that is, that of the soul's atonement and reunion with God. Positive asceticism does not struggle against the body, but rather against the seed of evil in the soul, for the sake of its reunion with God. Positive asceticism is universal. Everyone practices it. A scientist who shuts himself in his room with a view to pursuing his studies does so because he is taken up with the truth that he is seeking, and not because he wants to deprive his body of sun, fresh air, and other benefits or pleasures of the world outside his room. A ballerina fasts much so as to keep her body slender and supple. A doctor interrupts his sleep during the night if he is called out to a sick person. A missionary lives in a miserable hut in a village in Africa, as is his wish, not because he loves misery, but because he wants to share the lot of his brothers. The principle of positive asceticism is found enunciated in the Gospel in a way that could not be clearer. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who, on finding one pearl of great value, went and sold all that he had and bought it. Positive asceticism is therefore the exchange of good for better. Let us now return to the problem of innate human evil. What is it? It is ahamkara, the sense of self due to avidya, primordial ignorance, caused by Maya's power of projection, Viksepa Shakti, associated with Maya's power of obscuration, Avarana Shakti, which consists in the illusory identification of the true self, Atman, with the empirical self, as is clearly attested by the revelation of scripture, Shruti, direct authentic experience, Pratyaksha, tradition, Smriti, and inference, Anumana. This is the answer according to the ancient wisdom of India from the mouth of Shankara in the 9th century AD. The author of this summary and synthesis, Vivekudamani. It is desire, tanha, engendered by ignorance, avidya, which consists in attributing the central role to an illusory mental construction of the self, whilst the centre is nowhere or everywhere, answers Buddhism. The other current of tradition, the right wing of the entity of wisdom, if you wish, the Western, Egyptian, Jewish, Christian current, gives another reply. According to it, innate human evil is not due to primordial ignorance, but rather to the sin of knowledge at one's own instigation, instead of that through God. Pre-Christian emetic treatises, such as the Core Cosmu and the Divine Pimanda, and the Bible, Genesis, are in agreement that it is original sin which underlies innate human evil. Both the emetic treatises and the Bible state that the original sin was committed in heaven, that's emeticism, or paradise, in the Bible, before the original fall. Both pre-Christian emeticism and the Bible describe this original sin as an act of disobedience towards God, that is, a separation of the human will from that of God, and a discordance between these two wills, caused by the desire for another type of knowledge than that of revelation, and for another subject of knowledge than God and his revelation through the world. Among the emetic texts, it is Core Cosmu, which speaks in the most explicit way of the sin prior to the fall, whose consequence and punishment was the fall, where Isis says to Horus, "Having thus spoken, God mixed together the two remaining elements, water and earth, and breathed into them a certain life-giving substance, and spoke over them certain secret spells, potent indeed, but not so potent as those which he had uttered before. These things he stirred well together, and when the scum which floated on the surface of the mixture had become translucent, he took this, and out of it he fashioned the vital spirits of the animal circle, the zodiac. But the residue of the mixture he handed over to the souls that had by this time made progress, those souls that had ascended to the places near the stars, and had been given a new name, and were called holy daimons. And he said to them, "My children, offspring of my being, take the residue left over from my handiwork, and let each of you fashion something, relying on his own ability, and I will set before you as models those which I have made." And then he withdrew. And God arranged the zodiac in accord with the movings of nature, and having bestowed on it powers of all various working, he bade it be productive for all the animals that were to be in all time to come, that is, all that were to be born after the making of the first specimen or pair of each kind. And God promised to join to the visible works of their hands the invisible vital spirits, and to give to each of the creatures that should be made power to generate others like itself, in order that the souls might not thereafter be obliged to make anything else beside what they made at first. Said Horus, "Tell me then, mother, what did the souls make?" And Isis replied, "When the souls, my son Horus, had received the mingled mass, they first examined it and sought to find out what ingredients it was compounded. But this was not easy for them to discover. Thereupon they feared they might incur the Father's anger for having tried to find out, and they betook themselves to doing the work they had been bidden to do. They fashioned the race of birds, fishes, quadrupeds, reptiles. But the souls, my son, thinking that they had now done something great, began to arrange themselves in presumptuous audacity and transgress God's commands. For they sought to vie with the gods in heaven, claiming nobility equal to theirs, in that the souls themselves had been made by the same Maker. And so they now began to overstep the bounds of their own divisions of the atmosphere, for they would not any longer abide in one place, but were ever on the move, and thought it death to stay in one abode. But when the souls did thus, my son, the Lord of all, so Hermes said, failed not to mark it, and he sought a way to punish them. And so the ruler and master of all thought good to fabricate the human organism, to the intent that in it the race of souls might through all time suffer punishment. Now, let us look at the salient facts of this text. Souls are entrusted with fashioning animals according to their celestial models in the zodiac. But instead of accomplishing this synthetic work, they first examined it, the mixture, and sought to find out what ingredients it was compounded of. That is, they gave themselves up to analysis, preferring analytical knowledge to creative synthetic work. This had the consequence that they changed their fundamental attitude from the vertical attitude, God, soul, to the horizontal attitude, soul, world, and were ever on the move in the horizontal, for they would not any longer abide in one place, that is, the immobility of the vertical, since they thought it death to stay in one abode. Let us now compare these salient facts with those of the biblical account. There, man is placed by God in the Garden of Eden, called to the creative work of tilling and keeping it. He lives under the law of the vertical. There are all the trees of the garden from which he eats, that is, methods of ecstasy and ecstasy, whereby through prayer, meditation, and contemplation the soul is elevated to God. And there is only one prohibition, that of eating from a single tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for on the day that he eats of it, he will die. Man in paradise gave names to all the animals that God placed under man's dominion, so that whatever man called every living creature, that was its name. Lastly, moved by the desire to have their eyes opened and to be as gods, knowing good and evil, Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden tree and were driven out from the Garden of Eden in order to cultivate the land. The similarity if not identity, of the two narratives leaps out at one. In both it is a matter of the sin of presumptuous audacity or impudent curiosity. In both man follows a desire to have his eyes opened and to be as God. In both man is entrusted with a creative magical task with regard to the animals. In both man changes his fundamental attitude from the vertical to the horizontal, which has the consequence that he incarnates, with the consequences of incarnation, suffering, toil, and death. Concerning the points of difference between the two accounts, souls fashioning animals, man only giving them their names, the places near the stars, the Garden of Eden, the multitude of souls, Adam and Eve, the composition of the mixture of the Father, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They are easily understood if one takes account of the difference that there is in general between the Genesis of Moses and the treatise Cor Cosmu. The latter teaches, that is, it gives an exposition of a teaching, whilst the former recounts the dawn of mankind and world history. The one is a commentary on the world, whilst the other is a chronicle of it. This is why even the facts and events in Cor Cosmu are presented in an intellectualized way, that is, insofar as and inasmuch as they are stated with sufficient clarity as ideas. With regard to the narrative in Genesis, it only presents to the mind of the reader, with magical force, the facts relevant to the spiritual history of the world and mankind. Cor Cosmu wants to convince, whilst Genesis awakens profound memories of a remote past which slumber in the depths of the soul, memories from the collective unconscious, as Jung would have said. Being a magical text, Genesis does not say that man fashioned the animals, but rather that he gave them names. Now, the name is the formative principle in the language of magic. To give a name means to say, in magic, to assign a mission, to charge with a function, and at the same time to render capable of acquitting it. Man, according to Genesis, gave the animals created by God their specific missions and functions on the plane of realization, which entailed a specific organism. He fashioned them by giving them names with respect to the plane of realization. With respect to the places near the stars and the Garden of Eden, here again the biblical account is magical. It does not aim so much at answering the question, where in the cosmos was mankind to be found before the primordial fall, as the question, what was mankind doing and what was happening around it before the fall. Now, the answer in Genesis is that mankind was set in a garden in order to till and keep it. This means to say that the dawn of humanity did not take place either in a desert where nothing happens, or even in a jungle where everything sprouts forth and grows without the regulating and directing control of the spirit, or, lastly, in the conditions of a city or town where nothing sprouts forth and grows, but where everything is caused and is done through the regulation and direction of the spirit. A garden is thus a state of the world where there is cooperation and equilibrium between spirit and nature, whilst a desert is a state of immobile passivity both of nature and spirit. A jungle is a state of activity of nature alone, and a town, lastly, is that of activity of spirit alone. One could say, making use of Hindu philosophical language, that a garden corresponds to the state of sattva, of nature, prakriti, towards spirit, purusha, and it was in such a sattvic milieu, or garden, that humanity was placed and was assigned its primordial and eternal mission, to cultivate and maintain this garden. Let us stop here for a moment, dear unknown friend, to breathe in again after the magnitude and significance of this compressed and lapidary statement from Genesis has so taken our breath from us. The primordial and eternal mission of mankind is thus to cultivate and maintain the garden, that is, the world in a state of equilibrium and cooperation between spirit and nature. What a world of content is found enclosed in seed form in this statement. May spiritual light, moral and practical, mystical, gnostic and magical, radiate forth when one opens one's heart and mind to the such touch of this seed statement. One then understands in a split second that it is not necessary either to do or to leave alone, either to build systems of thought or to let all thoughts pass through the head without control, either to devote oneself to exercises of occult, ascetic and mystical training, or to do without constant and continuous endeavor, that it is necessary to work and to allow growth, to think and to await the growth and ripening of thought, and that it is necessary for the magical word to be accompanied and followed by the magical silence. In a word, it is necessary to cultivate and maintain. To cultivate and to maintain culture and tradition. To will and to dare. To know and to be silent.